Well, hello, folks. As always, leave it up to me, Alex Jacobson, aka Spike Apples, to solve all the hard pressing, most burning issues and conflicts of the day and the era. Everybody today is talking about Syria. How are things going to develop in that country? What's the end game of different players on that Syrian field? United States, Europe, Muslim world, other parts of Muslim world such as Iran, Russia, of course, and so on. And I think I know what to do in order to establish a more or less lasting peace and reconciliation in that country. Um, Much has been made about uh, the conflict between uh, the Shiites and Sunnis in that country. Of course, Bashar Assad and his father Hafiz Assad come from the Alawite sect, which is kind of grouped for convenience, grouped together with Shiites, with those forces like Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite militant group, but they really are, from what I at least understand, a very specific and peculiar branch of Islam. So it's between them and Sunnis, which make up about 70% of Syrian population and the bulk of the opposition. And of course, currently, in the last couple years, the Sunni extremist strains such as Al Qaeda, Nusra, and now the ISIS have kind of got an upper hand in the Syrian events, which is predictable and unfortunately natural because when you are dealing with a brutal suppressor, a brutal dictatorship, the natural reaction, especially when you are not getting help from outside, is to turn to similar extremists on your own side. Uh, if you take, for instance, Ukrainian resistance army uh, in 1940s through early 50s, they were not your liberals. They are today heroes, and rightfully so in Ukraine, but by no means were they adherents of liberal democracy. But the fact was that in a situation when Ukraine was being repeatedly bashed and badgered and torn apart by its neighbors, Poland, Germany, Soviet Russia, uh, of course you start turning to a movement that is similarly militant and relying on force in order to overthrow force. That is how it always works. Unfortunately, it's never worked any other way. In order to overthrow an oppressive regime, either you have to have a stronger force than that regime possesses, or the regime has to be rotten enough to just crumble. That's not what seems to be happening in Syria right now. Bashar Assad, with support of Russians and Iranians, of course, I don't mean Russian and Iranian people, though people may there be brainwashed in those countries, but it's really the support of the regimes. So, with support of those regimes, he's clinging on to power and even trying to beat back the gains that various opposition groups, from moderate to militant to extremist, have made in recent years. But let's not forget that in Syria, about 10% of population are also Christians. There also are various very interesting groups such as Kurds, who mostly are Sunni Muslims but are not very religious. There are Druze people, there are various Christian groups, and those make up altogether about 10% of the population. Moreover, about 100, 120 years ago, there appeared ideology called Syrian nationalism, which was started by a bunch of Syrian Christian intellectuals, which claimed that no matter what religion or ethnicity you are, if you live on this chunk of the land, roughly from southeast Turkey to Sinai, that including Israel, that including Palestine, Lebanon, you are a Syrian because that is what if you take a look at history, ancient history, in particular, starting with the Seleucid Empire, the Greco-Syrian Empire, but even prior to that, that mega region really was often referred to as Syria, and that really is Syria, and all people living there are united by certain destiny, certain historical experiences that they share. Well, of course, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon should remain sovereign, separate countries. But as far as the idea, a Syrian idea that encompasses and uh, transcends all these religious and ethnic divisions, that's a very interesting thought. Now, let's return to today, to current moment. The head of the supreme umbrella organization, essential Syrian government in exile, is one George Sabra, who is a Syrian Christian. When people are talking about ISIS, Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and other extremist forces fighting Assad, they conveniently forget or simply don't know that fact that the leader, basically the main, at least formally the main and most authoritative anti-Assad figure, is a Christian. Now, many people have been concerned about fate of Christianity in Middle East. In Syria, in Iraq, where of course after overthrow of Saddam Hussein, which I consider an absolutely benevolent and positive fact for whatever problems there may have been in Iraq since then. What was before was much worse. But of course, there is always instability after you overthrow a brutal dictatorship, and that instability and insecurity befell in particular Iraqi Christians, most of whom are Syrians. But in Syria, of course, Christians make up about 10% of population. That's a sizable force. And they do not have many reasons to be that fond of Mr. Assad, because they had lost some possessions, some lands, and some natural resources under the rule of the Assad dynasty. They've been kind of, used in a way as hostages and a kind of pawns, if you will, or bargaining chips in this caboodle, and that needs to be stopped. And since even Mr. Assad says that he does not want to necessarily cling to power forever, when even Russian government, Mr. Putin, Mr. Lavrov, and so on, who say that they want to save Christianity in Middle East, who try to pretend to be defenders of Christianity and so on, they seem, in my opinion, all to have solid reasons to look into Mr. Sabra and other Christian Syrian figures. Sorry. If there were to be some kind of transition process, which would be meant to be a mean to avoid possible bloodbath after possible, currently not very likely, but in future still quite possible event of Damascus takeover by opposition forces. If we want to avoid that, if we want to avoid the retaliation and retribution, violence against the Alawite community, probably having somebody from seemingly a neutral community, which does not have a stake either in Bashar Assad or in ISIS, having somebody to lead New Syria would be probably the best situation. I understand that such transitions have been made before. There was a reconciliation process in Nicaragua in late 80s through early 90s. By the way, today Nicaragua is governed by a left-wing president who was the main leader of the left-wing pro-Soviet force during Nicaraguan civil war, Mr. Ortega, and he got elected in a democratic and free election. Now, whether they are happy with him is another matter. But listen, if Mr. Bashar Assad or somebody like him eventually down the line won a democratic election, so be it. People have a right to choose their government. Um, so this all, in my opinion, seems to descend into one spot, into one point. Somebody like George Sabra or some other Christian Syrian figure could very well be the most satisfactory person to take over the reins in Syria and lead the country into era of true prosperity, not the false propaganda baloney that was spun during Mr. Assad's reign, and hard but necessary process of reconciliation of different ethnic, religious, and other communities. Let me also, along the way, note that another leader of so-called Free Syrian Army is none other than the first Syrian and second ever Arab astronaut. If people like that have defected the Syrian Assad regime, that speaks volumes about what people, even within that regime, thought and felt. Because it's almost as if, say, Yuri Gagarin would escape Soviet Union. This all having been considered, I officially call on the world powers, the world organizations such as United Nations, Arab League, and so on, to consider this scenario of persuading Mr. Assad to quit the post of president of Syria and have preferably Mr. George Sabra assume that position. Sincerely hoping that my plea will be heeded. Yours truly, Alex Spike Apples Jacobson.